Hi everyone, Destiny Juntano here, Internet's busiest music nerd. It's time for a review of the Music Genome Project by Pandora. Okay, but seriously, I want to do a deep dive on the Music Genome Project. It's a super fascinating subject, a massive undertaking, and it was pioneered by Pandora, still owned by them. Pandora, if you recall, was the first real player in the budding music streaming industry at the time. So what is the Music Genome Project? Well, it's an active effort to capture the essence of music at the most fundamental level, using various attributes to describe songs and mathematics to connect them together in an interactive map of sorts. It's basically a very arduous and analytical way of cataloging music in scrupulous detail. It's analogous to trait determining genes for living organisms in the field of genetics. And it remains the core technology used today to power Pandora Radio. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of how specifically the project works, I want to ask the question why? Why embark in such a gargantuan endeavor to over-precisely describe music in so many words? Seems like overkill, right? Well, keep in mind again that Pandora was the first big name in the music streaming industry, and music streaming itself was largely unexplored territory in the mid-2000s, with younger audiences still preferring to download music illegally. But I distinctly remember in high school art class, whenever we were working on projects and stuff, our art teacher was always using Pandora to play music, and he told me that it's because he loved Pandora for discovering new music. That phrase there, discovering new music, is one of the cornerstones of all major music streaming platforms today, and it's the defining cornerstone of how Pandora was created and continues to operate. First, I want to go over how music recommendation worked in the past and how it works now amongst popular music streaming apps. For generations, radio, retail, and word-of-mouth recommendations drove music discovery. New music was curated by DJs, record store staff, and our closest friends. By the late aughts, though, the discovery scene began to shift, with CD sales waning and digital downloads and up-and-coming streaming platforms taking a greater role. So right now, today, how do music streaming platforms in general help listeners to find new music? The short answer is that it's very complicated. For one thing, most platforms are not exactly divulging the specifics of how their technology works, as that kind of qualifies as a trade secret. But taking Spotify's Discover Weekly as a specific example, that playlist gets generated for you using a combination of machine learning and collaborative filtering models, which analyze both your behavior and the behavior of other listeners. The Spotify model isn't purely machine-based, but songs are crowdsourced from listeners in their libraries and then smartly and quickly analyzed by computers. For a lot of people, Spotify's robo-playlists are more than enough to satisfy their needs for music discovery. In my experience, Spotify is the streaming platform that I use most frequently, with a little bit of Bandcamp and YouTube Music mixed in, mostly because it's just so ubiquitous that it's kind of hard to get away from, for better or worse. I'll admit, though, that Spotify's recommendations, like when the app autoplays after I finish an album, or when I check out the fans also like section of artists that I'm getting into, are pretty helpful for me. I've certainly stumbled upon plenty of artists and albums that I like just by using Spotify. Spotify's music recommendation system can be boiled down into two concepts: exploit and explore. When Spotify exploits, it's using information that it knows about you, the user. It's taking into account your music listening history, songs you've skipped, what playlists you've made, your activity on the social features, even your location. But when Spotify explores, it's using information about the rest of the world, like playlists and artists similar to your taste in music that you haven't heard yet, the popularity of other artists, and more. Moving on to other platforms, SoundCloud's website states that suggested tracks are selected by an algorithm that returns recommendations through a network of relations and interactions on SoundCloud. For example, a user liked a track, a user followed another user, a track is reposted, etc. Apple Music has a whole section dedicated to recommendations in their platform called For You. According to Apple Music, its experts handpick songs, artists, and albums based on what you listen to and like. And this content is what populates the For You section. For You recommendations get better over time based on whether you love a song or not. At the forefront of the For You section is the Friends mix. Every Monday, those who have connected with friends via Apple Music will get a 25-song playlist populated with tunes that their friends have been listening to. You're noticing something here? All of the major competitors in the music streaming space, of course, want to find new music to recommend for you. But how do they find those recommendations? Well, it seems like they mostly just lean on the music listening tendencies of all the other users on their platform. And that's fine when you consider the fact that you have millions of different songs to scrub through and millions of different users to recommend music for. As a surface level way of discovering new music, streaming services can definitely get the job done. But basing the core of your music recommendations on what other people are listening to has its shortcomings. The first pitfall is that it just becomes a popularity contest. Now, technically, there's still merit to be had there. If Spotify or any music streaming platform's goal is to keep you on the platform, then obviously they want to give you music that you like. Spotify tries to fill that gap by recommending more of the same, which is cool if that's what you want. The positive is that there's a high percentage chance that you'll like the music that you're discovering. The negative is that you're probably going to run into very little variety. You can get stuck in a rut and continue hearing the same sounding music. Because of this, Spotify is typically going to go for the most surface level recommendations. I feel like this happens most often when I'm listening to a really popular artist. Spotify will just recommend a bunch of other artists that I'm already familiar with. It's not really helping me go out of my comfort zone. For example, look at what happens when I go to the album Radio for Damn by Kendrick. It recommends J. Cole, Tyler the Creator, Childish Gambino, Kid Cudi. I'm not saying that any of these artists are bad or anything like that, but I'm pretty confident that anyone who already regularly listens to Kendrick also already regularly listens to all these other artists. Let's look at another example from a different genre. If I go to the album Radio for OK Computer by Radiohead, I find Black Country New Road, Arcade Fire. I also find Boards of Canada, which I'll give credit where credit's due. It's actually a pretty interesting recommendation. But then somehow it also recommends the song High and Dry, which is just from another Radiohead album, twice. Like, these are definitely some sensible recommendations, but even like a cursory Google search would have given you the same recommendations. So popularity contest, that's the first issue. The second issue is that conceptually, you're not really curating music for someone. You're just robotically saying, okay, you like this artist. Other people also like this artist. You should listen to what those other people also listen to, which is not necessarily correct. Essentially, there's a failure to acknowledge any qualities of the actual music that's being recommended. Just because I like Bob Dylan and someone else likes Bob Dylan does not automatically mean we have the exact same music taste. And I get that this kind of overlap becomes, I guess, a bit more statistically viable once you have a lot of music listeners to compare habits with. But what if you don't have that much data to go off of? What happens when you discover a new and unheard of artist? How is Spotify going to know what kind of music those listeners like when there really isn't a lot of data to extrapolate or analyze? One real life and very serendipitous example of this gap in Spotify's algorithm was when the 14th Dalai Lama released his debut album. Yes, you heard me correctly. The Dalai Lama, as in the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, has an album that you can listen to on Spotify. It's titled Inner World, and is a very meditative, peaceful, almost ambient collection of Tibetan music with spoken word vocals. However, for whatever reason, when it was initially released, the only people that were listening to it were internet music nerd weirdos. So as a result, when you tried to create a radio station for the Dalai Lama album, your playlist would get populated with songs by Death Grips, Caro Caro Bonito, JPEG Mafia, 100 Gex. Basically a lot of music that sounds absolutely nothing like peaceful Tibetan meditation music and has absolutely nothing to do with the Dalai Lama. But this happened because Spotify isn't actually personally recommending music to you. It's just comparing your music listening habits with the habits of other users and trying to fill in the gaps, which has the potential to result in sometimes hilarious inaccuracy. So what is Pandora's answer to this speedy yet imperfect method of music recommendation? The answer is the Music Genome Project. What is it? Well, Pandora themselves describe it as the most sophisticated taxonomy of musical information ever collected. It represents several years of analysis by our trained team of musicologists. And when was it created? The Music Genome Project was first conceived by Will Glasser, an original co-founder of Pandora Media, in late 1999. And it was later populated with musicological input from Tim Westergren, another co-founder in early 2000. In January 2000, they joined forces with John Kraft, the third and final co-founder, to found Savage Beast Technologies to bring their idea to market. In 2005, the company would change its name to Pandora. I had this idea to codify the genomic approach to understanding musical taste and leveraging technology and the web to build a recommendation engine, Westergren said at Vader Splash in 2011. How does the Music Genome Project work? Well, again, referencing from the source, each song in the Music Genome Project is analyzed using up to 450 distinct musical characteristics, or genes, by a trained music analyst. Each gene corresponds to a characteristic of the music. For example, gender of the lead vocalist, prevalent use of groove, level of distortion on electric guitar, type of background vocals, the list goes on. Different genres of music will also have different genes. For example, in rock music, you might ask how syncopated are the beats, how distorted is the guitar, how melodic or riff heavy is the guitar, how aggressive are the vocals. Whereas for pop music, you might ask how synthetic are the instrumentals, how repetitive is the chorus, how high is the BPM, how vernacular are the lyrics. There's really a lot to break down when you think about it. Each gene is assigned a value in between 0 and 5 in half-integer increments. These attributes capture not only the musical identity of a song, but also the many significant qualities that are relevant to understanding the musical preferences of a listener. All this said, though, keep in mind that we'll probably never really know the exact step-by-step process by which all of this happens, again, because it qualifies as a trade secret. So how do these genes and numeric values get assigned? Well, there's a team of song deconstructors at Pandora that get together in meetings and debate the exact quantifications of all of these different characteristics about a song until they eventually reach a consensus. According to Pandora, the typical music analyst working on the Music Genome Project has a 4-year degree in music theory, composition, or performance, has passed a selective screening process, and has completed intensive training in the music genome's rigorous and precise methodology. To qualify for the work, analysts must have a firm grounding in music theory, including familiarity with a wide range of styles and sounds. Seems a bit stuffy, if I'm being honest, but in general, I think you can trust that the music analysts at Pandora definitely have a commitment to and training in the art of music. One huge bottleneck with a system like this, though, is that whenever Pandora, and especially in its beginning stages, wants to add an entirely new genre of music to the platform, it has to arrive in a big batch, about 3,000 pieces of music, because Pandora's algorithm needs lots of choices to be able to recommend something that sounds similar. And all of those 3,000 songs have to be pulled apart first. This entails squaring the very different structures of the new genre of music with Pandora's genome data points. There's no denying that compared to many of its popular competitors, Pandora has a much smaller catalog of music, but it's by design. For example, in 2009, when Pandora was first adding Indian music to its repertoire, one group of deconstructors assembled for their meetings over the course of 6 weeks and analyzed 650 pieces of Indian music. And they would get together and debate over the most seemingly frivolous qualities that you might never even think of. I mean, it gets extremely specific. They would assign a 0 to 5 value for how risky the percussion of a piece is, or how rhythmically intense a piece is. I mean, when you compare 6 weeks of subjective debating with a computer algorithm that can recommend new music to you in an instant, you'd have to ask, what is the end goal here? Why do all of this? Well, the goal is to be able to recommend music to you without having to rely on the opinions of other music listeners on the platform. It's an attempt to analyze the structure of a song so that Pandora can identify similar songs that a searcher might like. To get a little nitpicky, I guess that does ultimately mean that Pandora is trying to recommend more of the same music to you, but in contrast with Spotify, it's much more likely to take you off the beaten path. Let's try our same album radio examples from before again, but on Pandora. When I autoplayed after OK Computer, I did admittedly get some predictable recommendations again, like Arcade Fire and also the Pixies. But I also got recommended Guster, the Sea and Cake, even the Devin Townsend Project. I mean, imagine someone telling you that they like the alternative rock band Radiohead, so you recommend them the progressive metal band Devin Townsend Project. I mean, there's certainly some crossover appeal there, but that is such a risky and bold recommendation that I gotta give respect to that. When I tried the same thing with Damn, again, I'll admit that the recommendations included some pretty popular artists like J-Rock and Action Bronson, but also there were some less popular artists included, Rob Stone, Goldlink, Danny Lay. I'll say that these recommendations reek significantly less of Billboard Hot 100. Ultimately, though, Pandora doesn't want to recommend music to you just because other people happen to like it. Pandora wants to recommend music to you because it actually sounds like the music that you already enjoy, regardless of popular choice. This mentality seeps its way into the deconstruction process on Pandora as well. While the assignment of genes to songs involves expert, subjective judgment, they aren't qualitative in the traditional sense. There's no rating that allows an analyst to conclude that a guitar or sax solo is simply lousy, What Pandora's system largely ignores is, in a word, taste. Music liking isn't being determined or funneled by the platform. Rather, it becomes a matter decided by the listener and the intrinsic elements of what is heard. Early on, co-founder Tim Westergren actually flirted with the idea of not even revealing the artist that you're listening to unless you asked. He thought that maybe the structure would give users a kind of permission to evaluate music without even the slightest bit of cultural baggage. We're so insecure about our tastes, is what he would say. Over the course of 20 years, Pandora's team has created a vast repository of musical analysis data, which is only possible because of the amount of time that Pandora has spent doing this laborious project. At first, the process was carried out solely by human musicologists, but over time, in order to scale, technology has become a part of the process. Now it's a constant give and take between the people and the programs, as the musicologists evaluate the accuracy of the machine's annotations and teach the AI to recognize less apparent attributes. I also want to take time to touch on how the actual Pandora platform and app work in general. The Music Genome Project is, of course, at the core of the streaming platform, but how exactly does Pandora use this massive project to help its listeners? Well, when the platform was originally created, its design seemed to reflect a more user-friendly version of radio, which in some ways was the precursor to curated playlists. On Pandora, you'd listen to radio stations for a specific artist or a specific genre. In fact, for a long while, you couldn't even play specific songs on Pandora. You could only tune into radio stations. For a long time, radio was, for better or worse, the main way that many people would discover new music. So at its inception, Pandora felt like a very natural progression in the realm of music discovery, while simultaneously diving into uncharted territory. However, over time, general music listening habits have given way to on-demand listening, which is most certainly the norm today. Of course, I enjoy the flexibility of being able to listen to whatever I want, whenever I want, but in many ways, you could argue that the rigidity of having to tune into a radio station, having no choice but to pay attention to what's curated for you, adds a bit of natural curiosity and exploratory nature that has been taken away by the convenience of music streaming today. So even though the process of breaking down music and compositions for the Music Genome Project is very manual, the separate process of what to actually recommend to a music listener on the fly is procedurally done by a computer. There's debate over whether or not computers can be as proficient or even more proficient than humans when it comes to music recommendation. Humans still play a large role in music discovery everywhere, but with that comes a bit of a barrier to entry and, of course, a large amount of man-hours, research, and dedication. It's easy to see why more and more companies and music listeners are turning to automating their music recommendations. To put things in perspective, when Pandora was originally launched, there may not have been a more efficient way to pick out the hottest new artists or songs for recommendation. The only viable route at the time may have been to enlist elite tastemakers. But today, with 20 years of technological advancements under our belts, you're possibly better off building a smart system that can learn from the real world, in order to help you predict who and where the next big breakout star might be. As a bonus, it's also a much less elite taste-making process, much more democratic, allowing everyone to discover the next big breakout star through their own collective tastes and not through the individual preferences of a select few. There are also things that music algorithms pay attention to about your music listening habits that you might never even consciously notice, like the kind of music that you prefer on evenings after work, or the kind of music that you regularly seek out on weekends after breakfast. Pandora's ambitious platform in particular isn't only about dissecting music, it's also about dissecting its listeners in order to determine what's best to recommend to every individual at every hour of the day. Every Pandora user begins with cold start recommendations based on their gender, their age, and even their zip code. It's like, hey, we barely know anything about you, so let's give you something that people listen to in this age range or location. As users continue their listening journey, they can utilize the thumbs up or thumbs down functions, which tells Pandora what users like or what they prefer to not hear again. Similar features exist on Apple Music, YouTube Music, Spotify, you name it. But implicit feedback is even more telling. Pandora measures engagement based on which songs users skip, either in part or in full, while replays reinforce how much a user likes a song even more than a thumbs up. In the end, Pandora uses a healthy mix of both human and machine parts to curate music. A bot can only annotate music to a certain extent. With Pandora, there is a team of experts who fine-tune the recommendation engine, which is mostly decluttered by AI. Personally, I spend a lot of time trying to discover new music, and I do most of my listening on Spotify. So when I give an album that's new to me a listen, I'll actually give it a solid 5 to 7 listens over the course of like 6 weeks before I feel like I'm able to give my final verdict. Let's say it's a 30-minute album, so that's like 3 hours of listening to the same album over the course of 6 weeks. I've noticed that even if I don't like some albums that much, they still end up getting incorporated into my daily mixes or in my autoplays, or they get re-recommended to me like crazy. And trust me, I try to be pretty frantically organized about this sort of thing. I liberally use the like button on Spotify when I want to be recommended more of the music that I'm currently listening to, but still it doesn't feel quite precise enough. Spotify just ends up recommending me more of what I've already spent a lot of time listening to. Now, I get why this makes sense, and I'm sure it works for a lot of people. I have a friend that recommends plenty of interesting bands and albums to me that I've never heard of. And when I ask him how he finds all of these interesting recommendations, he tells me that he finds them via Spotify's Robo playlists. I'm sure that most people are not hardcore music nerds who are obsessively trying to find new music all the time.
But I still can't help but feel that there's a lot of room for improvement with Spotify's recommendations. They just don't always feel that personalized.
Rather, they kind of feel like a very surface level of curation is happening. Ultimately, my own music discovery journey involves a lot of proactive reading and scouring of music blogs, review sites, as well as personal suggestions, with Spotify's recommendations sometimes being a helpful bonus. With streaming platforms, there's also a bit of a political aspect to consider. There are increasing concerns about the decisions that streaming services have in regards to the impact that they can have on what kind of artists, tracks, genres get advertised, whether by human creators or by algorithms, and whether that deliberately or inadvertently puts certain tracks, artists, or genres at an advantage or a disadvantage. I mean, remember when Drake released his album Scorpion in 2018? Spotify plastered Drake's face across their entire homepage. They used Drake as the cover for multiple, if not all, playlists on their homepage, some of which didn't even have anything to do with Drake, like Independent Ladies and Best of British. There's definitely a case to be made for more transparency being needed as streaming services evolve their curation systems. It's these shortcomings in algorithmic recommendations and many more that enable me and plenty of other people to continue seeing music curation as its own art form that some will always prefer. It takes a true fan of an artist or genre to be able to curate well, to bring a listener on a voyage of discovery. Curation is, in a sense, a form of teaching, of sharing. Who is qualified as a tastemaker? Well, ironically, I don't really think taste plays that important of a role in it. Rather, someone who has a deep appreciation and understanding of the music that they love is qualified in my mind. Someone whose empathy goes beyond the songs, into the history, the influence, and connections between artists and genres, the visual components, and the craft. Another point to consider is how new artists, new trends, and new genres can become popular in the first place. Great music pushes and challenges the status quo. New genres often appear as reactions to social conditions. Think punk and rap. And often are initially disparaged by the mainstream. The music is born like a virus and spread by small groups of passionate people until it's popularized. Everything about these genres contradicts the concept of what current listeners are most likely to listen to next. I mean, think of an album like Metal Machine Music by Lou Reed of Velvet Underground. Released in 1975, that album features no songs or recognizably structured compositions. There's literally no melody or rhythm to be found on the entire record, only modulated feedback and noisy guitar effects, as the album title would suggest, and the whole thing is mixed at varying speeds by Reed. This album was such a drastic departure from his previous work, so unexpected and so confounding even, that it almost cost Reed his credibility in the music industry. But why am I talking about this album now? Because in hindsight, it has been looked upon as being a forerunner for experimentation in noise and industrial music. Despite being almost unanimously panned by critics and listeners at the time of its release, you could wonder if Nine Inch Nails, Sonic Youth, Swans, or any remotely abrasive experimental musical act would even exist today without Lou Reed taking the risks that he did on Metal Machine Music. Hypothetically, if streaming platforms were curating for us when this album was released, I highly doubt it would have shown up on anyone's release radar. But instead, the album has continued to gain influence, popularity, and even notoriety through word of mouth and the collective desire of music listeners and music makers everywhere to push boundaries and explore new ground. To oversimplify, I think that music streaming platforms in general aren't great at expanding your tastes. They can definitely give you a good baseline of new artists and music to work with, but for the most part, they excel at keeping you under the same umbrella of music that you're already aware of. It's kind of like an echo chamber that just rehashes variations on the same theme. So it definitely takes a bit of manual labor to push your musical taste and find something that challenges you, but your efforts will absolutely be worth it. With automation and AI-driven technology becoming increasingly prevalent in more ways than one, where does music curation stand right now in 2022, and what does its future look like? Could you argue that algorithmic recommendations are influencing culture itself? I definitely think so. And I definitely think there's something to be said about the power that we bestow upon music streaming platforms and their algorithms in terms of how they can truly act as gatekeepers for popularity in the music industry. It's not a good thing. Nevertheless, it doesn't look like the music streaming landscape that we know today is going away anytime soon. Streaming is the dominant force of recorded music right now, and its power only continues to grow each year. And admittedly, there's no denying that streaming platforms help us navigate the tens of millions of tracks that we can choose from. If algorithmic recommendations are here to stay, though, what does that say about the elite musical taste-making cultures of old? Do they have to die by the wayside to make room for streaming platforms? Maybe in some people's eyes, but I don't think so. The internet is a pretty insane place in all regards, and you're bound to find any circle of weirdos if you look hard enough. And you don't have to look very hard at all to find communities of music nerds who are collectively fiending and scouring to satisfy their hunger for music consumption. There's also no need to separate tastemaking from music streaming. They can coexist harmoniously. Take Bandcamp, for example. Is it a music streaming platform? Kind of, but it operates very differently from basically all the other players in the music streaming space. For the most part, you can't just freely stream or share music on the platform. There's no playlist functionality. It's not exactly an all-you-can-eat buffet. The brand itself is more focused on nurturing the relationship between music creators and their fans. So you have to purchase an album unless it's free to download in order to listen to it, at which point you can stream just that album that you've purchased whenever you want. So since there's no autoplay or playlists on Bandcamp, how do users find new music? Well, you can browse through the app and you can quickly and easily see that there are tons of thoughtfully written blog posts, features, lists, artist profiles, interviews, and more. The resources to find new music are right in front of you, but you're not exactly going to be spoon-fed music to listen to like with other platforms. You got to dig past the surface, do a little bit of research and reading, and learn a bit more about the music and where it comes from. As a music listener, once you cross a certain threshold of curiosity, you're eventually left with no choice but to take a more active role in finding music. A big part of this, though, is having a better idea of what kind of music you really like and why you like it, and just keeping an open mind in general. Oftentimes, it's easy to be swayed by popular opinion. You should listen to this artist because everyone loves their new album, or you shouldn't listen to that artist because everyone knows they suck. But at the end of the day, nobody or no platform can make you listen to anything. It's all just suggestions, and everyone will have different expectations and preferences for how a recommendation system should and shouldn't operate. Conceptually, I think all music fans can learn a lot from the objective ideology of the Music Genome Project, even if you don't use Pandora. At its core, the project aims to pay close attention and break down the minutiae of music, which I think is a great habit to take up. It's fun to sit down and really critically think about the music you're listening to. Ask yourself, why do I like the music that I like? What specifically do I find so appealing about it? Is it the vocal performance? Is it the melody? Is it the songwriting? Or conversely, you can ask yourself, why don't I like this artist that everyone else likes? Is there, what am I missing? What specifically about the music turns me off? Is it that the lyrics don't resonate with me? Is it that it's just a sound that I'm unfamiliar with? Maybe the next time you're listening to your favorite song or album, you can play the part of the song deconstructor. Maybe you'll notice something new. So yeah, that's the Music Genome Project. I don't know how to end this video.